Okay, we did say it's Monday morning. Sorry, we lost you there for a bit, Dr. Von Eck. It's such a pleasure to have you here this morning. Former CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors South Africa, Dr. Claudelle is the founder of Brave Inflexions. Her practice focuses on leadership, governance, change management, ethics, culture, and whistleblower support. She's a strategic advisor, executive coach, facilitator, trainer, and keynote speaker. She is an experienced executive and non-executive director and has served on numerous international committees and task teams. Her doctoral degree is in leadership with a particular focus on change management. She drove the establishing of the Anti-Intimidation and Technical Practice Forum, which is an umbrella body made up of a number of professional bodies to provide a safe space for whistleblowers in the profession and to provide guidance on how to keep safe in the process. She is a member of the ESCOM SOC Limited Board of Directors. What an honor to have a guest of your caliber on the show this morning. We looked for inspiration and guidance and lots of smiles and laughter. Good morning, Dr. Claudelle
Good,
Von Eck.
good morning. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. An absolute pleasure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
You know, as I was saying to you before we went on air, that there are so many caps, very interesting caps that you wear. And I think people would be quite intrigued in finding out about why, what, where, and exactly what is it that you do. But before we get into all of that, I'd really like us all to find out and to meet. Uh, may I call you Claudelle?
Oh, please do, please do. I'm a
Right.
Generation Xer. The titles don't mean much to me.
Great. So tell us about your background, your early family life. Let us get to know you.
Sure, sure. Your early family life. So I grew up in a township called Estrist, that is in Pretoria, so to the east of Pretoria. And I'd say very happy childhood, although I only really later discovered in my life that there were underlying trauma because I grew up in the midst of apartheid.
Uh huh.
So little Claudel grew up in the 70s, a little isolated, not quite understanding what's going on. And so when I say underlying trauma, so I still have very vivid memories of little Claudel standing at the in the schoolyard. So the primary school was diagonally opposite the high school,
Uh
and
huh.
just remembering the commotion, so when there were protests, these, I mean, we call them the big kids, or the big kids,
Yeah.
with placards and singing, and the Caspers and the police, and not
Right.
understanding what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say that we were never, as little people growing up in that time, we were never debriefed.
Correct.
Um, but other than that, grew up, I was very, very, very fortunate that I had both my parents into my adult life. Dad is late now, but mum is still around. And so very strong, solid household. Mum was a teacher.
Okay.
Dad was a lab technician. But dad was a little bit of a feminist as well. So that we were all girls.
Oh,
Uh,
lovely.
yeah, so we were raised to believe that we can do what we can do, right? So there were no comparison with the boys.
Right.
Um, but yes, and I think that has shaped a lot of who one becomes. I'm an
Mm-hmm.
eldest child,
Okay.
and I always say that that is part of the reason why I have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. Sometimes I feel I'm so responsible that I'm irresponsible towards myself. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's childhood in a nutshell.
Right. And at the same time, when you say elders, then this is where the leadership qualities come in, right? Because all I think the grooming happens when you're growing up as well.
Yeah, yeah,
And that comes with a great responsibility, and I'm sure values that you were taught by your parents.
yeah.
But coming
Mom,
back,
mom always
yeah,
used to, mom always, let me quickly, the analogy
yes,
that my mom used to use all the time, and you only really, when you're an adult, you realize what they did to you. My mum used to say, "You're the head of the snake. Wherever you go, the little ones follow." And that was ingrained in me, that you always have to be aware of the consequences of your actions and your decisions, because it affects others.
Right, and with the result, then you become the mentor unwittingly, hey? But then coming back to your experiences growing up during apartheid, I think all of us that grew up in that era, somehow or the other, were activists in our own way. And how did that impact on what, shaped your future in terms of making the changes or having been a victim, so-called victim of apartheid? It was difficult years for us.
Yeah. No, they were very difficult years for us. And I think, often it is only much later in life when you start to look back over your life and you start to connect the dots, that you start to see, oh, okay, I ended up where I am because of the things that were going on at the time, the sense of justice, the
Right.
sense of empathy,
Mm-hmm.
understanding the pain, and
Correct.
wanting to correct the world. So what I didn't mention earlier on, as a child, my very, 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 very first career choice, before I actually really knew what career was, as a 6-year-old, when the kids were asked, what is it that you'd like to be when you're all grown up? And the typical, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, and so forth. Claudelle's response was, I want to be a missionary.
Uh-huh.
So I never ended up being a missionary, but I did.
Okay, yes.
So and what I mean by that is, throughout my adult life, there's always been a little bit of wanting to save, wanting to correct wrong, wanting to bring about a much more just society.
Right.
So you as I said, you later on in your life, when you look back, then you start to see, okay, this is how it affected me. But
Right.
certainly my worldview today, when I look at the world, when I look at our systems, our economic system, for example, it definitely is influenced by having been on the receiving side of
Mm-hmm.
injustice.
Right.
So I look at the world, and for me, it's very messed up. So if I
Mm-hmm.
look at capitalism, for example, I don't see myself in the camp, in the core of capitalism, especially as it is. I was going to say evolved, but it's probably devolved
Mm-hmm.
from the 70s. And what it
Right.
has created is much more inequality in the world,
Right.
and one understand what it means, because you understand poverty.
Yes, yes. And the imbalance,
Yes.
right? Right. After the break, we continue with our very special guest, Dr. Claudelle Von Eck.
Me back to the comfort of my childhood in the smell of blackseed oil being applied by my nanny. Now I'm using tib blackseed in my own home to soothe sniffles and coughs, to help with digestion and immunity, and of course, as part of my beauty routine. After all these years, I've come to appreciate in finding comfort and shifa in trusted treatments like tib blackseed. You can find tib blackseed at all leading pharmacies or find out more at blackseed.co.za.
Our Children of the World project is designed to provide relief and support to vulnerable children in crisis-hit countries. Penny Appeal South Africa prioritizes assisting these children with medical assistance, educational resources and support, food security, housing, and psychosocial support. All of our interventions are channeled to ensure that the well-being of the child and their household is prioritized in meeting their needs in a dignified manner. You can find out more by visiting our website www.pennyappeal.org.za or call us on 031 110 0573. Penny Appeal South Africa. Small change, big difference.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness, and every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and freezer card calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Albeit Lodge, your true home away from home. Albeit is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities, conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities. Your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Albeit has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albeitlodge.co.za.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
We are in conversation with former CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, SA, and founder of Brave Inflexions. Dr. Claudelle Von Eck highlights her life's work in ethics, leadership, and the empowerment of people. And having heard what you said just before that, I think it has such a profound meaning to all of that, because you've turned your passion into something that we can all benefit from, and especially the role that you are in currently. So going back to what you were saying before the break in terms of wanting to be a missionary and in fact doing the work in such a wonderful way, I think it's more a calling, if we can call it that. But then let's talk about your education and what is it that led to choosing this profession and the love that you have for it.
Well, look, I said my first career choice was to be a missionary. By the time I got to matric, the choice had then changed. I suppose I became more realistic about who I am and where the world is at. And I wanted to become an architect. A lot of that had been interesting. Remember I said earlier on, my dad was a lab technician. That was his day job. But he also had his own part-time business, and he was a draftsman. So he drew house plans. Lots of houses in the township where I grew up were drawn by my dad. So, and I was daddy's little girl, so you can imagine, as the eldest daughter, the first one. So before my sister arrived, I had mom and dad for 3 years. And so I wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps. But at the time I applied to WITS and I didn't get in because they were very limited numbers that they were taking. And I had to then very quickly change feet. Ended up with a bachelor's degree in psychology. But then by the time I got to my third year, I was like, wow, you didn't think this through properly, Claudelle. Back then our people didn't go to psychologists. So it's like, your people are not going to go to you because psychologists are for crazy people. And there's a stigma on that, right? And there was no ways that I could see that white people would come to me as a psychologist. So I was like, yeah, no, you're not going to make money out of this. So I had to change feet. I then, from the BA, I completed a 3-year business management diploma. I then moved on to my master's in business leadership and then eventually the doctorate in leadership. So, and it was really continuous post-matric. It was very, very, very small break of, I think, about a year. But post-matric, there's about a total of 13 years of studying.
Yeah, I
So
can
1 year
imagine.
more than the time that I spent in school. But
Right.
most of it, except for the first degree, I was at WITS full-time.
Hmm.
But the rest of it was all studying whilst I was working.
All right. So, in terms of the exceptional work done with IIASA in building competent internal auditors in line with your stance on ethics, now, it's the first time that I'm actually interviewing someone in your field and at that level. So, it does sort of, I need to wrap my head around this internal auditors concept.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Look, most people, I need to explain exactly what it is because, firstly, there's often a bringing internal audit and external audit together on the same platform, and they're actually cousins, not the same thing, two
Okay.
different disciplines. Right? So
Right.
where external audit is really a financial discipline,
Right.
external auditors would look at first and foremost whether the financials that the company has put out are a true reflection of the financial position of the organization. Right? So, and to get to that, so they would need to check the numbers. They would need to look at. They would also look at the financial policies, the controls that are in place to give assurance. So essentially, they give assurance to the stakeholders who have a vested interest in the company that the financials are where the company is.
Right.
They then also would give an opinion on whether the company is a going concern. So if
Hmm.
you're going to if you want to invest in that company, that's information you want to have. But is essentially where the external auditors would give you assurance. Internal audit is a risk-based discipline. So it essentially looks at every single aspect of the organization. So it starts with what are the major risks of the organization, both your strategic risks and your operation risks. So you would have risk literally in every component of the organization. And so I
Hmm.
used to say to people when I was still the CEO of the Institute, a very
Hmm.
good example of a risk to the organization is me, the CEO, right? So if I don't have proper controls built around me, and I can literally, like a bull in a china shop, I can destroy the organization in a very short space of time before the board realizes what is going on. And there are lots of ways that the, CEOs can destroy an organization. One of those would be, for example, when there's abuse of power, and you start to see people leaving. And when people leave, there's institutional knowledge that leave the organization, and that's a huge risk to the organization.
Sure.
Reputational risk, for example. If the organization doesn't manage that area very well, and especially in more recent times, you've seen that organizations go under, not as a result necessarily of mismanagement, but if the organization's reputation is bad, consumers stop buying from them, and when that happens, it then has a negative ripple effect into the organization. So internal audit would look at everything, right? So from HR to marketing to sales and so forth. It also looks at the financial side in terms of the financial controls, but the financial side is really one of the numerous variables. So it
Right.
looks at governance in the organization, whether the risk is being managed appropriately. Internal audit would look at, is the organization identifying all its risks appropriately? And does it have mitigating controls in place? So that's in internal audit, really. So where external audit, to a large degree, their report are mostly for assurance for the shareholders and other stakeholders. Your internal auditors are essentially strategic partners to the business. And if the management listens to internal audit in terms of their recommendations, looking at the
Right.
findings, making sure that they're correct, then it puts the organization in a much better space. And so an internal audit reports to the audit committee like external audit. So functionally to the audit committee and only administratively to the CEO. So it has a fair degree of independence in the organization. Does that help you?
Yes, it does. Somewhat. Yeah, but it does. It does. In terms of, it's very encouraging. I beg your pardon. It's very encouraging to see that there's someone of your moral standing and moral compass that's actually sitting on a board such as this, as in terms of your stance on ethics, because there's a very, 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 very fine line in terms of ethics.
Yeah. Can I firstly say, ethics is not as simplistic as I think most people tend to look at ethics, and it worries me significantly that we have a very narrow view of ethics sometimes. And for many people, when they talk about ethics, it is about fraud and corruption. So,
Right.
and that is first and foremost in people's minds. And yes, absolutely, that is a very important component. But ethics is far broader than that, right? And I had come to the point where I stopped referring to myself as an ethical person. And here's the reason. Right? So I think that part of the problem that we often see in organizations and leadership is that we tend to think in absolutes. So when I say I'm an ethical person, I then leave I leave no room for my own mistakes, right? So if you
Okay.
start to understand that ethics is very complex, I have shifted to I am a human being who applies ethical principles. And by doing that, it forces me to start to think deeper in terms of what is it potentially that you may not be seeing. Right? So for me, it's about acquiring ethics intelligence. It is
Mm.
about an ethics intelligence for me is your ability to see ethical implications in actions and decisions. And often we miss it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and for me, at the center of that is, so what are ethical implications? It's really about do no harm, right? Or minimize harm. And I'm saying do no harm or minimize harm because you cannot always take all of the harm away, because we do need to deal with ethical dilemmas from time to time. But the first point of call is to be able to see where the ethical implication is before you can start to apply your mind in terms of how you mitigate against the risks in the ethical implication. And so your ability to see it, for example, let me give you an example. And where there may be ethical implications in an organization. I was asked this question a few months ago. If an organization appoints people who are not adequately competent, is that ethical? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And especially when that organization has a very important impact on society, on the economy, on the community
Exactly.
where it operates, it then becomes a very, very important question. Because
Right.
if people are not competent, they would then essentially, in terms of their productivity or how they make decisions, that would have a ripple effect, and it
Correct.
can cause a significant amount of harm.
Right.
Now, do we have situations where you don't have a choice? Yes, absolutely. We've got to look at South Africa through the right lens. It's a developmental state. We're still living in the consequences of the majority of our people having come through an education system that that wasn't fit for purpose in terms
Mm-hmm.
of what we need.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that element that one has to take into consideration. But then it is about mitigating against that risk. So when
Exactly.
you do bring people in, the organization then has an obligation to ensure that there's accelerated learning and growth and development, right? And that has ethical implications. So if the
Right.
organization doesn't do its part, it has ethical implications. Now, that's what I mean by ethics intelligence, is your ability to look at every single situation where organization makes decisions and ask, what are the ethical implications here? Where are
Right.
the ethics risks? And if you don't ask that question, you may not see it. If you don't
Mhm.
see it, and then we will cause harm. The
Right.
other component in terms of ethics intelligence for me is your ability to maneuver through ethical dilemmas. Right? So
Uh-huh.
an ethical dilemma essentially is when you have two equally valid values, but they're opposing values.
Right.
Um, so how do you make a decision? You know, sometimes it is about choosing the lesser of evils, because the out that doesn't matter which way you go, there's going to be a negative impact. Somebody is going to feel harm. Then the question is, if I'm going to choose A, because A is the lesser of evils, how do I then deal with the potential impact? And then how do I minimize that? And it can become very, 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 very complex.
I can
You
imagine.
know,
Mm.
so if you look at a good example at the moment would be where the world is in terms of where we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the impact of human activity on the earth. But it's not just on the earth, it is about impact on something that is necessary for us, for our sustainable um, livelihood going forward in the future.
Right.
But most of us are living where the time that we're living in now, we're starting to feel the effects, but we're not truly living in the consequences of the human activity. It is our children and their
True.
children who are going to have to live in that. Huh? So the ethical implication goes across generations.
Mm.
Um, but then at the same time, so we're talking about now, the moment, we're talking about renewables, and we're talking
Right.
about just transition. So if you were to just cut off and move across, what does that mean for
Mhm.
communities where they have been dependent on carbon-based, carbon-based economy? So you've got to be able to look at it and say, now actually that is an ethical dilemma.
Mhm.
It is about the livelihood of the current generation versus the livelihood of future generations. And
Right.
what is
It's a
the lesser
huge.
of evil?
Right.
And how do you minimize in terms of the decision that you make? So I hope it's that is the reason why. And so the more and more I've been thinking about ethics and the depth of it, and how much there is around us in terms of ethical implications, and how little we're actually paying attention, is what
Yes.
brought me to the conclusion, Claudelle, you can't talk about yourself as an ethical person, because it implies that you're always making the right decisions, that you're always
Uh-huh.
seeing the ethical implications, that you're
Right.
always minimizing against harm. And I know that can't be true.
Right.
Logically speaking, it can't be.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. In fact, before we go to our next break, what I want to say is that your explanation on ethics and how you, translate that into your work is actually spills over into everything else that I'm looking at in terms of the role that you play. So we talk about whistleblowers, and we'll speak about the work you've done at Brave Inflexions, etc. But it does speak to your personality. It does speak to whatever else you believe in, and also, I think that it's important that you have people that you work with or under, your colleagues, your counterparts, that are aligned to your practice of ethics. Is
Yeah,
that a challenge?
absolutely. Um, and that alignment is not always all as easy as it may seem on the surface, right? Because we also often conflate ethics with morality. And for me, those are two different things. So your morality is informed by your background, your the belief system of your culture, and the religious group that you belong to, and so forth. Ethics is there intersecting points between the two, but not necessarily the same thing. So, and it does sometimes one has to even question your own morality. And I'll give you a very quick example. There, many moons ago, I was confronted by a very good friend of mine on the question of capital punishment. Right. So, and I was like, no, they're wrong. And I used to be a very black and white person until I realized there's a thing called ethical dilemmas. And the world isn't always that straightforward, right? And then, forgive me, that was a younger version of myself. I was very ignorant back then. And he had a different view. And he said, for example, look at the Scandinavian countries where they don't have capital punishment, but they, and it's not, it hasn't resulted in a society that is completely out of control. But then I started to think about what informed my belief. I had never, for myself, worked out how I had come to the conclusion that that is what I believe in. I was believing it because everybody around me growing up had that belief system. And when I really sat down with myself and I really thought deeply about it, I realized that I was wrong. And that was a moral stance where I had to shift. And that comes back to ethics. So yes. it's really important that one doesn't conflate the two and realize and understand that sometimes what we take as moral stances, that we can be wrong, and that we need to confront ourselves about what we believe in and why we believe what we believe.
Well, I think today our discussion is probably going to make many South Africans that are listening to us feel more encouraged about having people like yourself heading these organizations and talking to us at the level that you are in terms of your intellectual, moral, and of course, very principled life. We'll be back right after this break.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked, which charity is best? He replied, a drink of water.
Africa.
Every day, 2 billion people wake up and have no access to water and sanitation. Sponsor a water well for 14,800 rand, a borehole in Afghanistan for 49,500 rand, or a borehole in Africa for 55,000 rand with Africa Muslims Agency. Give water as a means of Sadaqah Jariyah today. Call AMA on 011 834 8685 or donate online. Africa Muslims Agency, commemorating 35 years of empowering, educating, inspiring.
You know, it's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying, or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
Devastating floods in Pakistan have washed away villages, claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people, damaged nearly 1 million homes, and left over 33 million people in desperate need of help. As the catastrophe unfolds, Islamic Relief is on the ground, reaching people with life-saving aid. Our team are working tirelessly to deliver food and shelter. Your support is urgently needed now to help save more lives. Donate now to Islamic Relief.
rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
Claudelle, what are your thoughts and views on the increase in whistleblowers on the forefront in the treatment they receive once they come out?
Yeah, look, it's really tragic. But I do think that as South Africans, and it's not just in South Africa, it's the world, but let's bring it down to South Africa. South Africans, we need to take collective accountability for where we are. And, because if you look at a combination of often whistleblowers go through what they go through because they stand alone. We're not prepared to stand with them because we are so afraid. We are more afraid of the consequences of standing with a whistleblower than being afraid of the consequences of a country
Correct.
that goes downhill, right? I always say this, we do have a problem in South Africa, certainly when it comes to corruption, fraud, criminality. But those people who are social deviants are in the minority. They're not in the majority. Good South Africans who want the best for the country are in the majority. The problem with the good South Africans is that we are not active enough in terms of speaking up when we see something is wrong. So you end up with only a few brave voices speaking up. We are not willing to put our necks out. And as I said earlier on, standing with the whistleblowers. And then in terms of, and that's just broadly as a society, I think we need to do a lot of introspection in where we are as a society. How whistleblowers are treated is a reflection of us collectively.
Right, right.
When it comes to organizations, I don't think that and of course there are pockets of excellence when I'm generalizing, and there are always exceptions to the rule. But I think that most organizations are not applying their minds deeply enough around how we're dealing with whistleblowers within our organizations. First and foremost, have we created an environment where we have a speak up culture, right? The climate in the organization would determine to what degree people are willing to speak up. And that's a leadership issue.
Right.
So asking the right questions around whether we've created that climate. Secondly, I think the importance around whistleblower support and whistleblower protection, because those two things are different things. So we tend to talk about whistleblower protection, and that's important, very important.
Yes.
But we don't talk deeply enough about whistleblower protection. Right? So, and it really goes for me at granular level to having conversations around, have we equipped our managers in the organization well enough to deal with when a whistle is being blown in their office? Sometimes we could have prevented a situation where the whistleblower was exposed. But because the person to whom the whistle was blown didn't deal with it appropriately, you're now sitting with a situation where the whistleblower is unnecessarily exposed, right? So it's thinking through, when we say protection, what does it mean? And then to be able to go to the ultimate extent. So realizing that when the situation is really bad, so we know that in South Africa, we have situations where people are prepared to kill whistleblowers. Is the organization doing enough from a protection perspective? So asking deep questions around how can they get to the whistleblower. It's not just about the whistleblower. It's also thinking deeply about family. So if the whistleblower's kids are exposed, what does that mean? So protection, I think we really need to look at the full scale. And make sure that our policies are crafted well enough, that they're understood well enough, and that they kick in fast enough. It doesn't help we come after the fact with the policy when the whistleblower has already been harmed.
Right.
The other component is support, and here I think we're really lagging as South African organizations. We we've got very little appreciation for the psychological trauma people go through when they have to blow the whistle. So you can imagine the
Yes.
anxiety. And this really comes, even if there isn't a real threat to their lives, still there is
Of course.
psychological trauma because we are social beings.
Correct.
And we are afraid of being ostracized. And that can create a significant amount of anxiety in an individual, right? And we come out of a history of mpimpis, right? So you're scared of being ostracized because that is what you are. So how do we make sure within the organization from a psychological wellness perspective and psychological safety perspective that we provide support? And in some cases, you actually need to bring somebody in from the outside to walk alongside that person who understands what they're going through and to be able to give them pointers in terms of how do they go through the process, keeping themselves okay, keeping their bodies okay, because we underestimate the stress on the body.
True.
Because you want to make sure that person lands on their feet when they get at the end of it. It is a very difficult walk to walk, and therefore we need to be a little more circumspect about it.
Indeed. And when we talk about Brave Inflexions, what are the different facets of the company and the inspiration behind starting this company?
Sure. Let me start with your second question first. The inspiration behind Brave Inflexions, when I left the Institute, I went into a sabbatical because, whilst I was at the Institute, I was literally, remember I said earlier, I was so responsible that I'm being irresponsible to myself. I worked long hours. I averaged 4 to 5 hours of sleep during the week. I worked through my weekends. So I had very little time to reflect and hear my own voice. So I felt it necessary to go into a sabbatical first and just hear and start to listen. And during that time, one of the first things I did was to create something that I've been wanting to create forever, was to build a website where I can go and put my thoughts. So it really was and dealing with like the conversation that we're having now, like the conversation we had around ethics and whistleblower, my thoughts around those things, and ended up with the name Brave Inflexions. But as I was building the various components of the website, so the business eventually started to drop as a shape, as an idea, and realized that actually it gives me a perfect avenue to do exactly what I would like to do. Right? And circling back to my first love, leadership, and being able to assist leaders. So my primary focus, although I do work outside of the more top tier leadership sphere as well, I just worked with a team on Friday, and that was like a full department, and so that's literally working with the various layers. But the primary focus is on executives and non-executives, and it's about having the leadership is training and also advice in that area, but really focusing on beyond the textbook stuff.
That's important.
The real stuff, when the pawpaw hits the fan, leading through crisis and so forth, and having the deep conversations around ethics. So leadership is the one component, ethics is the other component, and ethics is really just a default. It wasn't like I went and decided, like I did with leadership, that I want to do a doctorate in ethics. I did the doctorate in leadership, but ethics was just a natural flow from where I was. And then change, because the doctorate also are focused on specifically on leading people through change and uncertainty. And may I add, I graduated in 2007, and when we hit 2020, 2021, I realized that when I was talking about uncertainty back then, I had no idea what I was talking about. We really started
Yes.
to understand what uncertainty means when we had to go
Right.
through the pandemic. And then culture,
Right.
culture eats strategy for breakfast, and really working with leaders and making sure that looking at culture through different lenses. You've got to look at culture from an ethics perspective. You've got to look at culture from a performance perspective, and whether culture is fit for your strategy.
Right.
So there are various lenses that you look at culture, and then of course what we've already been talking about, whistleblower
Sure.
support, and just giving advice around that, but working with
Right.
whistleblowers.
What drives you?
Sure. I think for me, really at the center of everything is a very intense sense of purpose. I completely am sold on the idea that every one of us have a purpose within the collective, right? And I also very firmly believe that, so you've been given a purpose. You're the custodian of the purpose. It's
Correct.
your role to protect that purpose, but that purpose is not for you. It is for the collective.
Correct.
So that the collective can benefit from your purpose. So with that responsibility comes, and this is where my executive coaching comes in as well, is making sure that you're the best version of you, because the degree to which the collective is going to benefit from your purpose is wholly dependent on where you are in relation to the purpose, but also very importantly, what version of yourself do you show up in? Is that the best version? So what drives me every day is I don't ever want to look back on my life and feel that I had robbed the collective of what I was supposed to give the collective. I
Love that.
very strongly believe that none of us have the right
I love
to
what you
rob.
just said. That's yes.
Yeah, we
Yes.
don't have the right to rob the collective of our purpose. It's not there for us.
Yes, and that in fact becomes very humbling, right? So
Yeah.
despite having all of the titles and positions, etc., yes, it's great to have it, but at the same time, that's in fact exactly what keeps one grounded.
Yeah.
Right? And what is the greatest highlight of your career? I know there may have been many, but time constraints. Let's see which one is it that you can pick.
Wow. Highlight from a positive perspective. I would say the moment when I was still at the institute, when I could see that the profession is starting to enjoy better recognition, and better understanding. And from the perspective, not so much from the perspective of I did that, because it's certainly not a one person thing, but understanding the importance of that profession to the health and wealth of our country. And seeing the penny dropping was for me really gratifying, because what it would mean is that South Africa would be better off. I always used to say, I don't work for the Institute. I work for South Africa through the Institute.
Right, right. Hence, as I said earlier, it's lovely to hear a South African like yourself speaking the way you do in terms of the love for what you do and how you are so passionate about making a difference through your profession and in fact your personality. There's a lot reflected about you in what you say, what you do, and how strongly you feel about carrying forth your purpose, as it were. I must make one last comment before we close this interview. I would love to chat to you all morning. And before I even end off, and it would be the last statement, I guess, but I'm really, really very grateful for the time you've made for us this morning. But my last comment is about the picture behind you. It took me a few seconds in the beginning before we introduced the show to figure out what is that, and then I did. So I've observed, and for me, that's also a reflection of you. You know, these African women that we are in our different shapes and forms. Why did you choose that? It's beautiful.
You know, it's one of those things where you only, when you reflect later, you realize, oh, actually, that was what was going on in my subconscious mind. I've become comfortable with the fact that there's a hell of a lot more going in my head than I am consciously aware of. And I was drawn to the picture. It's actually a portrait I bought for when I can't use a virtual background.
Uh-huh.
But specifically, that role of protection, embracing with empathy, and being always reminding me, you know, that you've got to carry on. There are going to be times that you're going to fall. There are going to be times that you make mistakes. And trust me, I've got my own fair share of mistakes. But you carry on because you have to protect the purpose.
Absolutely. And I can see the position held there. Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much. I love everything you've shared with us this morning, and I hope we can all learn from it and become as passionate as you are about what you do. And of course, use you as our inspiration and mentor as well as South African women and men for that matter.
Thank you very much for having me. I really loved the conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you to your listeners.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Right after the break, we continue with Mid Morning Talk with Najma Kota. Our next segment, of course, is on wellness.